Judge mocks young intern with Down syndrome, shocked when the senior judge steps forward. The morning sun streamed through the towering windows of the Manhattan Federal Courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Lucas Whitmore stood before the mirror in the men's room, adjusting his navy blue tie for the 10th time. His fingers trembled slightly as he smoothed down his meticulously pressed suit, the same one his mother had helped him pick out for his law school graduation just months ago. "You can do this, Lucas," he whispered to his reflection, rehearsing the presentation he'd spent weeks perfecting. At 26, he was younger than most interns at the prestigious judicial internship program, and he knew that his presence here raised eyebrows. Having Down syndrome had never stopped him from pursuing his dreams, but he'd learned early on that he had to work twice as hard to prove himself. The courthouse buzzed with activity as Lucas made his way to courtroom 3A, clutching his leather portfolio close to his chest. Inside were months of careful research and analysis on a complex immigration case, his first major assignment as an intern. He'd spent countless nights poring over previous rulings, legal precedents, and constitutional amendments, determined to prove that his appointment wasn't just, as some had whispered, a diversity initiative. As he pushed open the heavy wooden doors, Lucas felt his heart skip a beat. The courtroom was already filled with other interns, clerks, and several judges from the circuit court. Among them sat Judge Marcus Griffin, known for his sharp tongue and sharper rulings. Lucas had heard stories about Griffin's notorious temper, but he refused to let fear cloud this moment. "Next presenter," called out the clerk, checking her schedule. "Lucas Whitmore, with analysis on Martinez versus United States Immigration Services." Lucas stood, his legs slightly unsteady as he made his way to the podium. The room fell quiet, but not the respectful silence he'd hoped for. He could feel the weight of curious stares, hear the barely concealed whispers. Taking a deep breath, he began laying out his documents. "Today, I'll be presenting my analysis of the Martinez case, focusing on the interpretation of asylum laws and their application in cases involving..." Lucas started, his voice clear despite his nervousness. "Is this some kind of joke?" Judge Griffin's voice cut through the air like a whip, causing Lucas to freeze mid-sentence. The judge leaned forward in his seat, his expression a mixture of disgust and amusement. "Who authorized this presentation?" Lucas felt his throat tighten, but he stood his ground. "Sir, I'm part of the judicial internship program. I graduated cum laude from..." "Oh, I see what this is," Griffin interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is one of those charity cases, isn't it? Someone's attempt at inclusive hiring?" He looked around the room, as if seeking validation for his cruel observations. A few nervous laughs echoed from the back rows. The portfolio in Lucas's hands suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The words he'd so carefully prepared began to blur before his eyes, but he refused to let them see him cry. "My research is thorough, Your Honor. If you just look at the precedents I've cited..." "Listen, young man," Griffin continued, standing now, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the podium. "This isn't some feel-good movie where everyone gets to play lawyer. This is a federal courthouse, where real cases affecting real lives are decided. We can't turn this into a publicity stunt for disability hiring." Lucas felt his world spinning, but years of facing prejudice had taught him to stand tall. His voice shook slightly as he responded. "Sir, I earned my place here. My analysis is sound, and I would appreciate..." "Appreciate?" Griffin scoffed, picking up Lucas's carefully prepared brief only to toss it aside without even glancing at its contents. "What I would appreciate is not having my time wasted with this charade. This courthouse isn't a place for make-believe lawyers or token hires." The room had fallen completely silent now, the kind of silence that feels like a physical weight. Lucas could feel tears threatening to spill, but he blinked them back furiously. He thought of his mother's proud face when he'd gotten this internship, of all the nights he'd stayed up late studying law books while his classmates doubted him. Through the blur of humiliation, Lucas noticed movement at the back of the courtroom. Someone was standing up, someone important, judging by how the atmosphere suddenly shifted. But before he could focus on this new development, Griffin delivered his final blow. "Pack up your things, Mr. Whitmore," Griffin said, emphasizing his name with mock formality. "I'm sure there's some law firm's mail room that would be more appropriate for your capabilities." Lucas stood frozen at the podium, his hands gripping its edges so tight his knuckles had turned white. The research he'd spent months compiling lay scattered across the floor where Griffin had tossed it. In that moment, he felt every doubt, every whispered comment, every skeptical glance he'd ever received come crashing down on him at once. But something in him refused to break. With trembling hands, he began gathering his papers, maintaining what dignity he could. He might be humiliated, but he wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him run away. As he knelt to collect his scattered documents, he could hear Griffin's self-satisfied chuckle, could feel the mixed looks of pity and embarrassment from the other interns. What Lucas didn't see, as he carefully placed each page back into his portfolio, was the tall figure now moving purposefully through the courtroom, or the way other judges straightened in their seats as this person approached. He didn't notice how Griffin's smirk began to fade, or how the atmosphere in the room suddenly shifted from uncomfortable entertainment to tense anticipation. All he knew was that he wouldn't let this be the end of his dream, even as tears threatened to spill from his eyes and his hands shook with the effort of maintaining his composure. What he didn't realize was that this moment of humiliation was about to turn into something entirely unexpected, as footsteps approached and a commanding voice prepared to shatter Judge Griffin's moment of cruel triumph. The clicking of formal shoes against marble echoed through the now silent courtroom like thunderclaps. Senior Judge Thomas Whitmore, his silver hair catching the morning light, moved with the deliberate grace of a man who had commanded respect in these halls for over 4 decades. His weathered face, usually bearing the calm demeanor that had become legendary in legal circles, now displayed something rarely seen: raw, unbridled fury. The atmosphere shifted palpably as Judge Whitmore approached. Even those who hadn't worked directly with him knew his reputation, the architect of landmark civil rights decisions, the man whose dissenting opinions had later become constitutional precedents. His presence had always commanded attention, but now it demanded it. Judge Griffin's smirk began to falter as Whitmore drew closer. The senior judge's 6'2" frame seemed to grow taller with each step, his normally gentle blue eyes now sharp as steel. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as he passed the gallery, where clerks and interns pressed themselves back in their seats, sensing the storm about to break. Whitmore stopped precisely 3 feet from Griffin, close enough for everyone to see the slight tremor in his usually steady hands, not from age or weakness, but from carefully contained rage. His gaze fixed on Griffin with the intensity of a laser, making the younger judge shift uncomfortably in his expensive leather shoes. The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Judge Whitmore's reputation for measured responses made this uncharacteristic display all the more unnerving. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the courtroom with devastating clarity. "Judge Marcus Griffin," Whitmore began, each word carved from ice. "In my 43 years on this bench, I have witnessed countless displays of legal argumentation, judicial temperament, and professional conduct." He paused, his gaze never wavering. "What I just witnessed from you ranks among the most disgraceful exhibitions I have ever seen in a federal courthouse." Griffin attempted to maintain his composure, but beads of sweat had begun to form on his forehead. "Senior Judge Whitmore, I was merely maintaining the standards of..." Silence. The word wasn't shouted, but it might as well have been a thunderclap. Griffin's mouth snapped shut automatically, a response ingrained from his own days as a young lawyer when Whitmore had presided over his cases. Whitmore took another step forward, and Griffin unconsciously took one back. "You speak of standards, Judge Griffin? Let's discuss standards." His voice took on a dangerous edge. "The standard of human dignity. The standard of professional courtesy. The standard of actually reviewing submitted work before passing judgment." With each point, his voice grew more intense, though never losing its controlled precision. The gallery watched, transfixed, as Whitmore reached into his suit jacket and withdrew a familiar-looking document. "This analysis that you so casually dismissed?" I reviewed it last night. The research is impeccable, the legal reasoning sound, and the conclusions well supported by precedent. Griffin's face had lost several shades of color. Sir, I didn't realize you had a personal interest in this intern's work. Personal interest? Something shifted in Whitmore's expression, a change that made everyone in the room hold their breath. Oh, I have more than a personal interest, Judge Griffin. He turned slightly, his eyes finding Lucas, who still stood near the podium, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and confusion. When Whitmore spoke again, his voice carried a weight that would forever change the dynamics of the room. Lucas Whitmore is my grandson. The words fell like bombs in the silent courtroom. Gasps and murmurs erupted from every corner as heads whipped back and forth between Lucas and Judge Whitmore, searching for the family resemblance they had somehow missed. Griffin's face turned from pale to ashen as the full implications of his actions crashed down upon him. Lucas himself stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock. In all his years of preparation, all his battles to prove himself, he had never once mentioned or relied upon this connection. He had wanted to succeed on his own merits, and his grandfather had respected that wish, watching his progress from afar with quiet pride. But now, as Whitmore stood between his grandson and the man who had tried to destroy his dreams, the senior judge's protective fury was a tangible force. His next words came out in a near whisper that somehow carried more weight than any shout could have. And if you think my anger stems merely from family loyalty, you have gravely misunderstood the situation. His eyes narrowed. I am furious because a judge of this court showed such profound lack of judgment, such deplorable bias, and such moral bankruptcy that he has called into question every decision he has ever made from that bench. The tension in the room had become almost unbearable. Junior clerks were literally holding their breath, and even the other judges present seemed unsure whether to intervene or continue watching this unprecedented confrontation. Griffin opened his mouth to speak, but Whitmore raised a hand, silencing him once again. We are not finished, Judge Griffin. In fact, he said, his voice taking on a tone that sent chills down the spines of everyone present, we are just beginning. Because your behavior today has prompted me to take a much closer look at your entire judicial record. Griffin's attempt at professional composure crumbled entirely as the implications of Whitmore's words sank in. He knew, as did everyone in the room, that when Senior Judge Whitmore decided to examine something closely, no stone was left unturned, no detail unexplored, and no misconduct, if it existed, remained hidden. The senior judge turned slightly, addressing the entire courtroom but keeping Griffin in his peripheral vision. This court will take a 30-minute recess. When we reconvene. He paused, his eyes flickering back to Griffin with deadly purpose. I will have some very interesting documents to share with this assembly. As Whitmore turned to leave, his hand briefly touched Lucas's shoulder, the first public acknowledgement of their relationship, before he strode toward his chambers, leaving behind a courtroom so silent you could hear the air conditioning hum. Judge Griffin remained rooted to his spot, his face a mask of dawning horror, as he realized this was far from over. In fact, it was just the beginning of his nightmare. Time seemed to stand still in courtroom 3A as the magnitude of Senior Judge Whitmore's revelation reverberated through the space. The previously hushed whispers had transformed into an audible buzz of astonishment, as if someone had kicked over a hornet's nest of speculation and surprise. Longtime court employees who prided themselves on knowing every detail of the judicial hierarchy were frantically whispering to each other, trying to piece together how they'd missed this connection. A Whitmore? All this time? Margaret Chin, the head clerk who had worked in the courthouse for 25 years, muttered to her assistant. How did we not see it? The way he carries himself, that same determined look in his eyes. Judge Griffin stood rooted to the spot, his usual commanding presence deflated like a balloon. His mind raced through every interaction he'd had with Senior Judge Whitmore over the years, every case they'd discussed, every time he boasted about his own accomplishments in the older judge's presence. The weight of his public humiliation of Lucas now pressed down on him like a physical force. Your Honor, I had no idea, Griffin stammered, his voice having lost all its previous arrogance. His eyes darted around the room, searching for allies among his fellow judges, but finding only turned heads and averted gazes. If I had known. If you had known? A voice rang out from the gallery. It was Judge Patricia Rodriguez, known for her fierce advocacy of merit-based advancement in the legal profession. That's precisely the problem, isn't it, Marcus? Would it have made a difference if you had known who his grandfather was? Would that have made his research more valid? His presence more acceptable? Griffin's face flushed a deep red as he struggled to form a response. The very colleagues who had often laughed at his cutting remarks and cruel jokes were now watching his downfall with a mixture of satisfaction and self-conscious guilt. Lucas, still standing near the podium, felt as if he were watching the scene unfold from outside his body. Throughout his academic career and legal training, he had deliberately kept his connection to Judge Whitmore private, wanting to succeed or fail on his own merits. The secret had been a heavy burden, but one he'd carried willingly, determined to prove himself without his grandfather's reputation smoothing his path. I remember interviewing Lucas for the internship program, said David Morrison, the program director, stepping forward. His face showed a new understanding dawning. He never once mentioned his grandfather. His application stood entirely on its own merits. Graduated cum laude, editor of the Law Review, extensive pro bono work. I had no idea. The revelation was causing a ripple effect throughout the courtroom. Junior clerks who had previously ignored Lucas or treated him with condescending patience were now reassessing every interaction. The other interns, who had maintained a polite but distant relationship with him, were whispering among themselves, piecing together clues they had missed. He has the same office, one intern whispered to another. Remember? The corner office in the East Wing, the one that used to be Judge Whitmore's when he was just starting out. We thought it was just a coincidence. Judge Griffin, desperate to regain control of the situation, attempted to straighten his posture and gather his dignity. Senior Judge Whitmore has always been a mentor to me, he began, his voice quavering slightly. I have the utmost respect for. Save it, Marcus, interrupted Judge Sarah Mackenzie, rising from her seat. We all saw what happened here today. You didn't just mock an intern, you revealed your own prejudices, your own shortcomings as a jurist. How many other times have you made snap judgments without reviewing the facts? How many times have you let your biases cloud your legal reasoning? The question hung in the air like smoke, causing several other judges to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Griffin's reputation for quick, harsh judgments was well known, but until now, no one had dared to challenge it openly. Lucas, finding his voice at last, spoke up. I never wanted special treatment, he said, his voice clear and steady. I wanted to prove that someone with Down syndrome could succeed in this profession on their own merits. That's why I never told anyone about my grandfather. His words carried a quiet dignity that made several people in the room lower their heads in shame. The contrast between his composure and Griffin's unraveling demeanor was striking. The bailiff appeared at the courtroom door, announcing that Senior Judge Whitmore would return in 5 minutes. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Everyone present could sense that the revelations weren't over, that Judge Whitmore's dramatic disclosure of his relationship with Lucas was just the opening move in a larger strategy. Griffin began gathering his papers with trembling hands, his movements jerky and uncertain. Perhaps we should adjourn for the day, he suggested weakly. Give everyone time to process this unexpected development. Sit down, Judge Griffin, came the firm command from Judge Rodriguez. I believe Senior Judge Whitmore mentioned he had some documents to share with us. Documents concerning your judicial record, if I recall correctly. The color drained from Griffin's face again as he sank back into his seat. The other judges in the room exchanged knowing looks. They had all experienced Senior Judge Whitmore's legendary thoroughness in investigating judicial misconduct. If he said he had documents to share, they would be devastating. Lucas took his seat in the gallery, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room following him. The same people who had watched his humiliation in silence were now looking at him with new respect, tinged with more than a little fear of his grandfather's influence. But Lucas knew, as he waited for his grandfather's return, That respect earned through fear wasn't the kind he wanted. The next few minutes would change everything, not just for him, not just for Judge Griffin, but for the entire courthouse. As the seconds ticked by, the tension built like an approaching storm, and everyone present could feel that they were about to witness something unprecedented in the history of the federal judiciary. The stage was set for Senior Judge Whitmore's return, and with it, the next shocking revelation that would shatter Judge Griffin's world completely. Senior Judge Whitmore's return to the courtroom was heralded not by his footsteps, but by the weight of the boxes being carried in by 2 court officers. Each cardboard container was labeled meticulously with dates and case numbers, some going back nearly a decade. The officers placed them carefully on the table before the bench, the sound of heavy files hitting wood echoing through the silent room. Whitmore followed, carrying a single red file folder marked "Confidential" in bold letters. His expression had shifted from fury to something perhaps more terrifying, the calm, methodical demeanor of a man about to dismantle someone's entire career with surgical precision. During our brief recess, Whitmore began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of judicial authority. I made several calls to the Judicial Ethics Committee. Calls that, truthfully, I should have made years ago. He opened the red folder, removing a stack of documents with post-it notes marking specific pages. Judge Griffin, he continued, fixing his gaze on the increasingly uncomfortable man. Would you care to explain the unusual pattern of favorable rulings in cases represented by the law firm of Davidson, Meyer and Associates between 2018 and 2022? Griffin's attempt at maintaining composure cracked slightly. I don't understand the relevance. Let me be more specific. Whitmore interrupted, pulling out a document. Case number 2019 CV 4856, Harrison Development Group versus the City of Manhattan. A ruling in favor of the developers, overturning local zoning laws. 3 weeks later, your wife's consulting firm received a $500,000 contract from Harrison Development's parent company. Gasps erupted around the courtroom. Judge Rodriguez leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. That case set a precedent that affected dozens of subsequent zoning disputes. Indeed it did, Whitmore agreed, pulling out another document. And here's case number 2020 CV 7823, where Judge Griffin dismissed a class action lawsuit against Meridian Pharmaceuticals. 2 months later, his brother's medical research company received a grant of $1.2 million from Meridian's charitable foundation. Griffin's face had taken on a grayish tinge. These are coincidences, nothing more. You can't possibly. Coincidences? Whitmore's voice could have frozen fire. He gestured to one of the court officers, who began distributing copies of a detailed spreadsheet to the other judges present. This document shows every case you've presided over in the past 5 years where Davidson, Meyer and Associates represented one of the parties. Of the 78 cases, you ruled in their favor 75 times. The statistical probability of such a pattern occurring by chance is approximately 1 in 10 million. The rustling of papers filled the room as the other judges examined the evidence. Judge Mackenzie's sharp intake of breath was audible as she reached a particular page. These offshore account transfers, they coincide perfectly with the ruling dates. Precisely, Whitmore confirmed, pulling out yet another document. The Ethics Committee has been building this case for months, but they lack certain key pieces of evidence. Evidence that, fortunately, my grandson happened to uncover during his research. All eyes turned to Lucas, who reached into his portfolio and withdrew a separate file. I was researching pattern recognition in judicial decisions for my analysis. He explained, his voice steady. The statistical anomalies in Judge Griffin's rulings were impossible to ignore. When I dug deeper, I found connections between the cases and various shell companies linked to Davidson, Meyer and Associates. Judge Griffin shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is absurd. You can't possibly expect anyone to believe the wild theories of a... He caught himself before finishing the sentence, but the damage was done. A what, Judge Griffin? Whitmore's voice was deadly quiet. An intern with Down syndrome? The same intern whose legal analysis you refused to even read? The analysis that, incidentally, contained all of this damning evidence? The other judges were now passing the documents among themselves, their expressions growing darker with each page. Judge Rodriguez stood up, her face tight with anger. These aren't just ethical violations, these are criminal offenses. Bribery, corruption, obstruction of justice. There's more, Lucas said, stepping forward with another file. Judge Griffin's recent ruling in the Martinez immigration case? The one I was researching? He received a wire transfer of $250,000 from a Cayman Islands account the day after he ordered the deportation of key witnesses in a human trafficking investigation. The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Griffin's legs seemed to give out, and he collapsed back into his chair. The other judges were now standing, their faces showing a mixture of disgust and determination. I move for an immediate suspension of Judge Griffin's duties, Judge Mackenzie announced, her voice firm. And I formally request a full FBI investigation into all cases he's presided over in the past decade. Seconded, came a chorus of voices from the bench. Whitmore nodded gravely. I've already contacted the chief judge of the circuit. A formal investigation will begin immediately. He turned to face Griffin, who now sat slumped in his chair, all pretense of authority stripped away. And I believe the U.S. Attorney's Office will be very interested in these documents as well. Griffin finally found his voice, though it was barely a whisper. You can't do this to me. My reputation, my career. Your reputation? Whitmore's voice was like steel. You destroyed your own reputation the moment you chose to corrupt the very system you swore to uphold. But perhaps more tellingly, you revealed your true character today when you tried to destroy a young man's dreams simply because he didn't fit your narrow view of what a lawyer should look like. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. The corrupt judge who had mockingly dismissed Lucas's presence as a charity case was now being brought down by evidence that Lucas himself had uncovered. As court officers began collecting and securing the evidence, the weight of what had just transpired settled over the courtroom. A decade of corruption had been exposed, a powerful judge had been revealed as a criminal, and it had all started because he made the mistake of publicly humiliating the wrong intern. The day wasn't over yet, but Judge Marcus Griffin's career certainly was. The next few minutes in courtroom 3A unfolded like scenes from a legal thriller. Judge Griffin, his composure completely shattered, rose from his chair with the desperate energy of a cornered animal. His expensive suit, usually worn like armor, now hung on him like a costume that no longer fit. This is a setup, he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. You can't possibly expect anyone to believe that an intern, he gestured wildly at Lucas, managed to uncover what trained investigators couldn't find for years. Actually, Lucas interjected calmly, opening his laptop. It was your own arrogance that made it possible. He turned the screen to face the room, displaying a complex spreadsheet of data. You became careless. The pattern of your corruption was hidden in plain sight, spread across hundreds of cases. You never expected anyone to examine all of them simultaneously, looking for statistical anomalies. Judge Rodriguez leaned forward, studying the data with growing interest. He's right. The individual cases might not raise red flags, but when analyzed together, she shook her head in amazement. The pattern is undeniable. Griffin's eyes darted around the room like a trapped rat's, searching for any ally, any sympathetic face. But the colleagues who had once laughed at his jokes and attended his lavish dinner parties now stared back with cold contempt. His network of influence, built over decades of careful cultivation, was crumbling before his eyes. I demand a formal hearing. Griffin's voice rose to a near scream. This is a violation of due process. You can't just... Oh, you'll get your hearing, Judge Mackenzie interrupted, her tone arctic. In fact, I've just received word that the chief judge has convened an emergency disciplinary panel. They're waiting for you in conference room A. She checked her watch. They'd been waiting for 12 minutes, actually. The color drained from Griffin's face as he realized the machinery of justice, the same machinery he had corrupted for personal gain, was now turning against him with devastating efficiency. I need to contact my attorney, he stammered, reaching for his phone with trembling hands. "That would be wise," Senior Judge Whitmore agreed, his voice carrying a weight of authority that made Griffin flinch. "Though I suspect Davidson, Meyer and Associates might be somewhat reluctant to represent you in this matter, given their own involvement in your schemes." The mention of the law firm sent a visible shudder through Griffin. His eyes darted to his briefcase, and for a moment, it seemed he might make a grab for it and run. But court officers had already positioned themselves strategically around the room, their presence both casual and unmistakably purposeful. Lucas, still standing near his evidence-filled laptop, watched the scene with a complex mixture of emotions. There was no triumph in his expression, no gloating over Griffin's downfall. Instead, his face showed something closer to sadness, not for Griffin, but for the damage done to the justice system they had all sworn to uphold. "Your Honor," Lucas addressed Griffin, his voice steady and professional. "Would you like to review my analysis of the Martinez case now? It contains a particularly interesting section on the ethical obligations of federal judges." The irony of the moment wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Several of the other judges actually winced at the precision of the verbal thrust, delivered with perfect politeness by the very intern Griffin had dismissed as incompetent. Griffin's response was physically dramatic. He stumbled backward, catching himself against the edge of the bench. For a moment, it seemed he might actually faint. Then, drawing himself up in a last desperate attempt at dignity, he straightened his tie and turned toward the door. "This isn't over," he announced, trying to summon his former authority, but achieving only a pale imitation of it. "When the full story comes out—" "Oh, it will come out," Judge Rodriguez interrupted, holding up her phone. "The press is already gathering in the lobby. Apparently, someone tipped them off about a major corruption scandal in the federal judiciary." She smiled thinly. "I wonder how they knew." Griffin's face went from pale to ashen. The media, his longtime allies in crafting his public image as a tough, no-nonsense judge, would tear him apart. His carefully constructed reputation would be shredded in the morning papers. As if on cue, the doors to the courtroom burst open, and a court officer entered with urgent purpose. "Judge Griffin," he announced formally, "the disciplinary panel requires your immediate presence. And—" he paused, his expression grave. "Representatives from the FBI are waiting to speak with you afterward." The last vestiges of Griffin's composure crumbled. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, each step seeming to age him years. The man who had entered the courtroom that morning as one of the most powerful judges in the circuit was leaving it as a soon-to-be-disgraced former jurist. As he reached the doorway, he paused and turned back, his eyes finding Lucas one last time. For a moment, it seemed he might say something, an apology, perhaps, or a final act of defiance. But in the end, he simply lowered his gaze and shuffled out, followed closely by court officers. The heavy doors swung shut behind him with a sound of finality, marking the end of Judge Marcus Griffin's legal career. In the silence that followed, the remaining judges exchanged glances that contained volumes of unspoken communication. They all knew that this day would change their courthouse forever, forcing them to examine their own conduct and biases in a new light. Through it all, Lucas remained standing tall, his laptop still displaying the evidence that had brought down a corrupt judge. He had entered the courtroom that morning hoping merely to prove his worth as an intern. He was leaving it having demonstrated not just his legal acumen, but his unwavering commitment to justice itself. The wheels of justice had turned, swift and inexorable, and Marcus Griffin had been crushed beneath them. His fall from grace was complete, and the courthouse would never be quite the same. As the heavy doors closed behind Judge Griffin's retreating figure, the atmosphere in courtroom 3A transformed. The tension that had held everyone in its grip began to dissolve, replaced by a new energy, one of reflection and revelation. Senior Judge Thomas Whitmore turned to face his grandson, his stern judicial demeanor softening into something more personal, more vulnerable. "Lucas," he began, his voice carrying decades of unspoken pride, "I owe you an apology." The room fell silent again, but this time with anticipation rather than dread. The remaining judges, clerks, and interns leaned forward, sensing they were about to witness something as meaningful as the drama that had just unfolded. All these years, Whitmore continued, moving closer to his grandson, I've watched you fight your battles from a distance. I saw you graduate law school with honors, saw you apply for this internship, saw you work twice as hard as anyone else, and I said nothing. Lucas looked at his grandfather, emotion welling in his eyes. You did exactly what I needed you to do, he replied softly. You let me prove myself. Whitmore shook his head, a gentle smile crossing his weathered features. No, son. You did more than prove yourself. You showed everyone here something they desperately needed to see. He gestured to the room at large. You showed them that justice doesn't care about appearances, about preconceptions, about the easy assumptions we make about others. Judge Rodriguez stepped forward, her earlier anger at Griffin now replaced by thoughtful consideration. Your grandfather's right, Lucas. Your analysis didn't just expose corruption, it demonstrated a level of legal thinking that many seasoned judges would envy. The statistical analysis alone, added Judge Mackenzie, lifting Lucas's laptop with newfound respect, shows an understanding of pattern recognition and legal precedent that's genuinely impressive. This isn't just thorough research, it's innovative legal methodology. Lucas stood straighter, accepting their praise with quiet dignity. The same colleagues who had earlier watched his humiliation in silence were now looking at him with genuine admiration, not because of his family connection, but because of his demonstrated abilities. I've spent my entire life, Lucas said, his voice clear and confident, hearing people tell me what I couldn't do. That Down syndrome meant I couldn't be a lawyer, couldn't serve justice, couldn't make a difference. He smiled, gesturing to his scattered research papers. But I learned something important along the way. Limitations are often just other people's assumptions waiting to be proven wrong. The room absorbed his words, and more than a few people shifted uncomfortably, remembering their own unspoken doubts about his capabilities. Whitmore placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder, and this time there was no attempt to hide their connection. When your mother first told me you wanted to be a lawyer, Whitmore revealed, I was worried. Not because I doubted your abilities, but because I knew how cruel this profession could be to those who are different. His voice caught slightly. I kept our relationship quiet because I thought I was protecting you. Instead, you ended up protecting the integrity of this entire courthouse. David Morrison, the internship program director, stepped forward with a document in his hand. Which is why, he announced, I'm offering Lucas a permanent position as a judicial clerk once his internship concludes. His methods for analyzing judicial patterns could revolutionize how we monitor court decisions for bias and corruption. The offer drew spontaneous applause from the assembled crowd. Lucas accepted the document with steady hands, his eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. This was what he had worked for, not just acceptance, but genuine recognition of his abilities. There's something else, Whitmore added, his voice carrying across the now buzzing courtroom. The chief judge has asked me to head a new committee on judicial integrity and bias awareness. Lucas, we'd like you to be part of it. Your perspective, well, it's exactly what this courthouse needs. Lucas looked around the courtroom, the same room where, just hours ago, he had faced humiliation and dismissal. Now it was offering him a chance to help shape the future of judicial oversight. The symmetry was not lost on anyone present. I accept, he said firmly. On one condition. He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. This committee needs to look at all forms of bias, not just corruption, but the subtle prejudices that keep qualified people from being given a chance to prove themselves. His grandfather nodded, pride evident in his eyes. Agreed. And I think we've all learned today that sometimes the best legal minds come in unexpected packages. The remaining judges murmured their agreement, many making notes, or quietly discussing the implications of these changes. The courthouse would never be quite the same, and that was exactly what it needed. As the crowd began to disperse, Lucas gathered his materials, including the analysis that had started it all. A young intern approached him hesitantly. Mr. Whitmore, she said, I have Down syndrome too. I'm in my first year of law school, And when they told me about you, well, you're the reason I thought I could do this. Lucas smiled, remembering his own moments of doubt and determination. You can do this, he assured her. Just remember, justice doesn't see disabilities. It only sees truth. As the afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors, Lucas stood beside his grandfather. They were no longer just Senior Judge Whitmore and the intern with Down syndrome. They were two generations of legal minds, united in their commitment to justice. Ready to change the world? Whitmore asked his grandson. Lucas nodded, clutching his files close. One case at a time, Grandpa. One case at a time. The story of Lucas Whitmore, the intern who brought down a corrupt judge and changed a courthouse's perspective on ability and justice, would be told for years to come. But more importantly, it would open doors for others who had been told they didn't belong in the halls of justice. For in the end, true justice is blind not only to wealth and status but to all the artificial barriers humans create. And sometimes it takes someone who sees the world differently to make others see the truth more clearly.